Hello, and welcome to Week 2, Unit 1 of Application Development for SAP Business by Design. In this unit, we'll be talking about structure of business objects, what business objects are, how are they designed within SAP Business by Design, and what are some of the common pieces of them. Business objects basically represent specific entities that are relevant to business. This could be something like a purchase order, a sales order. It could be an employee or an account, generally a business partner. Could even be some type of activity. It's basically some entity that we want to represent within the application itself. Now, business objects within SAP Business by Design contain what are called the number of nodes. They contain actions, associations, different elements for each node, and this culmination of these items is basically what represents the object and the behavior that that object has. As I mentioned in the previous week, the framework that's in place provides all the typical CRUD operations for us. So create, read, update, and delete. So we don't have to define these types of operations. The framework automatically knows what to do with our business objects, and we can worry about the design of them and the specific behavior of that object. There are many, obviously, standard objects that are delivered in SAP Business by Design. We'll see a lot of these when we get into extensibility, as well as a brief look at some today. And then we have objects that we would create ourselves, partner objects, sometimes called custom objects, basically something new that we have defined as developers within the SAP Cloud Application Studio. To build our objects, we're going to use what's called BODL, the Business Object Definition Language. This is the language that's in place to help us define the business objects and what these different parts are. And it'll be slightly different than when we get to the actual scripting or the behavior of these objects later on. The object first is built up, as I mentioned, of a number of nodes. Inherently, every object has some type of root node. This is really the header of the object. The main details are stored on here. So for a purchase order, you'd have the description of that order, the ID of it, maybe the creation date and time, whoever created it. Who's responsible for that order? These types of details might be stored on the header level or the root of this object. Now, the object itself can have any structure of nodes you want. So there's always the root node, but a root node will have subnodes, and those nodes could have subnodes of their own, etc., etc. You can get as complex as you want here. For example, in this purchase order, we have the purchase order root node, and we have a number of subnodes: item, buyer party, seller party, and delivery terms. You can also see that the relationship, the cardinality of these nodes is in place as well. So we'll have only one buyer party, seller party, or delivery terms for the purchase order, but we'll have one or more items as part of the purchase order. And so building up this type of structure will basically generate and create the business object that we want. You may have business objects that are very simple and only have a root node. You may have some that are a lot more complex and have many nodes. It depends on the use case and what the object is being used for. Now, every node itself will have elements. Elements are the attributes of that specific node. Some type of data. So for an purchase order ID, you'll need an element on the root node that represents purchase order ID. It could be as simple as a name of ID, or it could be purchase order ID itself. When you're naming yours, try to use names that are relevant to what that actual element is. You wouldn't need to say, let's say, item ID. Maybe you just say ID because you know it's on the item node. Same as just ID on the purchase order. But maybe you have an external ID that's coming in that you want to specifically say external order ID, something like that. Every element, though, will have a name and an associated data type. What kind of data can be stored in this specific element? Now, there is a large number of data types that are available to us in the application. You can use the link in this slide to see what all is possible, or in the repository explorer, which we'll see in a little bit. But to give an example, on the sales order root node, we have an ID, and that is of type business transaction document ID. This is a very common data type for IDs within SAP Business by Design. You'll see it used a lot in standard objects. Also, for example, order date time. This uses the global date time data type. That way it gives us a general place to store a date and a time code associated with it. and it'll give us the structure that we need to do that. Same with data origin type code. Name, we use what's called medium name. You'll see for texts and strings that there are a number of text type data types in the system. Some will be something like medium name, which will give you a place to store the name, as well as an associated language code. So if you want to say that in English the name is my order, but in German or Spanish it's another type, another text, you can specify that with that data type medium name. Whereas if you use what's called language independent medium name, there is no language code there. It's just a simple text field of a specific length. Same for gross amount. This uses the data type amount. Amount is a very common data type. It's used to store monetary type values. So you will have, as part of that data type, a field to store the actual number amount, as well as an associated currency code that goes along with it for free. So now you can say that the order cost is 10,000 US dollars. And the data type, if we use amount, basically helps us out in doing that. We now don't have to say what's the total order amount field and the total order amount currency. By using just the amount data type, we get both of those for free. And there's a lot of data types like that within the system. Now, all of our data types are built off of, at the most basic, the W3C data type standards. So things like string, float, things like that. We build our core data types on top of those. So this is where amount would come from. In general, code. So you have a key value pair. Indicator, which is the Boolean for the SAP Cloud Application Studio. And then on top of that, we might have more specific, the global data types that are there. Maybe specific data types that you've created. So again, for example, phone number will have a structure to it to store the area code, an actual number, a country code. Address type data types will give you a place to store a street number, street name, country, state, or region. So each data type is very beneficial depending on your use case. And there are tons and tons of data types in the application. So try to use what's most relevant for your specific use case. You'll see that we won't be able to create our own data types within the SAP Cloud Application Studio. There are tons of data types, so very likely there is something that will fit your use case. The only caveat to that is that we will be able to create our own code list data types. So any type of key value pair or other code list that we have, we can create a data type based off of that. And we'll see this in a later unit. Now, business objects have, as we said, the object itself. They have a number of nodes and some type of tree-like structure, and each node will have any number of elements. Now, nodes can also have what are called associations. An association is a one-way relation between two different business objects. So, for example, here we have a sales order, and in the root we have the buyer ID. We may have an association of the buyer to the actual business partner that exists in the system. So if I know that this person is a business partner within my system right now, and I want them to be the buyer of the sales order, I probably don't want to copy the data from that buyer into my sales order object. It's excessive, it's duplication of data. I now have to make sure that if it's updated in the actual buyer business partner, that I have to get that updated into my sales order. So to avoid this, we can actually use an association to basically say, hey, I know where you are. I have a reference to you, to the business partner object that is this buyer. So if I need any data from you, specifically, I can always just go to your reference and get that data. So I always have the most current and up-to-date data, and I'm not duplicating anything. I may have some other details around the buyer that I want to keep in the sales order that are specific to sales order, but not the business partner in general. But the association is going to allow me to basically reference that data of the other object. And we will use associations throughout our scenario. They're very helpful, very useful when you're building your objects. Also, business objects are part of what we call deployment units. We saw a deployment unit in the last unit when we were talking about solutions, and we created our solution in the customer relationship management deployment unit. A deployment unit is really a type of software package to help segregate functionality within the system. We have lots of different deployment units within SAP Business by Design. One key one being Foundation. This is where we store a lot of the common objects that are in the application. So business partner, activities, these type of things are stored within the Foundation deployment unit. There's also then specific ones depending on the area. So customer relationship management would have your sales order, your marketing, opportunity leads, whereas human capital management would have your employee compensation agreement, other HR related items. And so there's many different deployment units where all of our objects are sorted into. Now, an important thing for us as application developers is that when we, first of all, we define a solution within a specific deployment unit, but then the business objects themselves, how they exchange data depends on the deployment unit they're in. Now, if you have an object, two objects that are within the same deployment unit, so for example, lead and opportunity, both part of CRM, I can directly reference the two in code within my code. I can have them create and update data between each other without any additional work, just basically saying create opportunity, maintain field with this data from the lead, etc. If I want to go across deployment units, I now have to use what's called an internal communication. I can't directly reference the object to maintain its code. I'll be able to read some data from it, but if I want to maintain values in an object in another deployment unit, I'll use what's called this internal communication, kind of an internal web service, so to speak, that will then pass the data from that I've specified as part of this communication to the object in the other deployment unit. It's a very common use case. It's not that difficult, maybe just a little different to get used to as opposed to straight coding across, but it still allows us to build just about anything we need to and maintain data across different objects. One that we can always read data from is Foundation. Foundation is a special deployment unit, in which case any deployment unit can read data from there and be able to use that data accordingly within the solution. So you'll see this, you may run into this during your developments. I would recommend to go ahead and play around with it a little bit, try it out in different scenarios. It's a good thing to get used to of how it works. We'll talk a little bit more about internal communications when it comes to integration. So these are some of the main things in business objects. Other things that we can put in a business object are messages. So an actual message text that we want to raise, where I can say that I have a message. The static text is whatever I want it to be defined, and I can actually have variable placeholders in that message. So I can say, for example, sales order placeholder was created. And later on when I raise that message, I can say that sales order ID 123 was actually created. So we can define messages as well. And then actions. And actions is actually going to be our next unit. We're going to talk about, actually 2 units away, what an action is and basically the behavior that's there in the actions. So this summarizes what develops a business object. Really, an object, again, is just some type of business entity within the application, representing something that we need to have some value to, a sales order, business partner, material. And there's some type of node structure to help build this entity. There's always a root node. No matter what, every business object has a root node. But you may have one or more subnodes and a tree-like structure building with more and more subnodes. And every node in itself will have at least one element, if not more. And those elements are basically the attributes of that specific node. Each element itself has a data type, and there's many data types available to us. And then within the nodes, we can have associations, messages, actions, and we can continue to build more and more complex objects as we need. Now I want to show you real quick a standard object, since we haven't built one of ours yet, within the system to see what the standard object looks like and point some of these things out. So I'm going to go ahead and open the studio here. I'm logged into the studio. Let's go to View and then Repository Explorer. Now we're going to come back to this in extensibility, but this shows a lot of great info for us as developers within the studio. Between the help content and this, the two will provide almost anything you possibly need to be able to develop something. So this is really an important view for us. I've selected the employee object here. You can see there's some details on the right-hand side. It tells me what the object is, what the namespace is. We'll see namespaces in the next unit. What's the deployment unit? I want to know what the deployment unit is. Some other details. You can see there's some public solution model info. We talked briefly about PSM, and we'll get into it later on. Also, it gives me some great code examples about working with employees, etc. Now the employee itself, let's go ahead and open this up, and what it's going to do is show us what the root node is and then what the root node has, and we can drill down in the object from here. And for each of these places, whether it's the root node itself or any subnodes or even associations, it's going to again show us more info about it. So here's the root node. It again talks about some PSM info, what the elements are and the data types of these elements. So I can always see if I want to know what type of data type is used for the ID of an employee. I can see here's internal ID, and business partner internal ID is the data type. So I could then look this up and see and use it in my solution. But it shows all of the elements that are on the root node here. I can see what are the actions for this object. So this has an action. And you can see also here's a number of associations that it has. And down here are the subnodes. So you can see employee obviously is a very complex object. There's a lot of information that we want to store about employee. What relations it has to other business partners. Identification stores some basic info about this employee within the system that's relevant to SAP Business by Design. Address information, etc., etc. And each of these nodes, again, will have more elements, more associations. It could be as complex as you really want it to. So that sums up this unit where we talked about what business objects are. In the next unit, we're actually going to go ahead and create our own first business object. So for that, thank you very much.